Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and greetings to our lecturer IR alias bin Kamis. My name is Nurul Hazani Husna binti Shahrizal. My group members are Dayana binti Abdul Razak, Linggesh anak lelaki Manugaran, and Muhammad Amran bin Muhammad Rizwan. The title that we choose is OSH Use and Standards of Exposure of Chemicals Hazardous to Health Regulation 2000 for our assignment 1.
A very good evening to Sir Alias. My name is Lingesh, so I'm going to talk about the introduction for our assignment 1. So the Occupational Safety and Health Act 1994 is a piece of Malaysian legislation that was published on February 25, 1994 by the Malaysia Parliament. The basic goal of OSHA 1994 is to protect employees' safety, health and welfare at work from any workplace danger or risk activity. The Occupational Health and Safety Act is made up of 21 sets of regulations. These regulations set out the parameters and requirements for the area they govern. The regulation that we choose for our assignment 1 is the OSH Use and Standards of Exposure of Chemicals Hazardous to Health Regulations 2000. Besides, the Occupational Safety and Health USECHH Regulations 2000 are the sixth set of regulations issued under the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1994. So basically, the goal of the USECHH regulations is to create a legal framework for employers to control hazardous chemicals in their use and to establish occupational exposure regulations to protect the health of employees and others at work. The regulations clearly stipulates the responsibility of the employers, including self-employed person, in respect of his employees and any other person, so far as is practicable to protect their safety and health from being affected by chemicals hazardous to health. So the regulation has 12 parts where the arrangement of the regulation is listed below. So part 1 preliminary, part 2 we have identification of chemicals hazardous to health, part 3 permissible exposure limit, part 4 assessment of risk to health, part 5 action to control expose, part 6 we have labeling and relabeling, part 7 information instruction and training, part 8 monitoring of exposure at the place of work, part 9 health surveillance, part 10 medical removal protection, part 11 warning sign, and the last part is record keeping. Thank you, that's all from me.
Assalamualaikum and salam sejahtera to Sir Alias. My name is Dayana binti Abdul Razak. I am from the EK Section 1 Group 1 and my matrix number is D0120101447. For assignment 1, I do the provision of regulation and I will explain about part 1 and part 2. The first point is the occupational safety and health use of standard of exposure of chemical hazard to health regulation 2000 must come into the operation on 4 April 2000. Second, the airborne concentration to a chemical means of the quantity for a chemical that can measure in terms of its value or mass for air of the number in fibers. Third, the word approved is written by the Director General, and the meaning of assessor is where the employee or any other person can be appointed by the employer and have registered with the Director General to carry out an assessment of risk to health. Fourth, the ceiling limit can be the airborne concentration that should be not exceed during any part of the working day. The Director General is also appointed under subsection 5(1) of the Act. Meanwhile, engineering control equipment can be any equipment which is used to control exposure of employees to chemical hazard to health. Lastly, the duty of employer and self-employed person is where any of duty can be imposed by this regulation. Next, for the part 2, identification of chemicals to health. First point, an employer should identify and register record of all chemicals hazard to health that is used in the workplace, the average quantity that is used, produced and stored for each month or each year, whichever is applicable for each of the chemicals hazard to health. Second, the process and work area where the chemicals are used and the name and address of the supplier of each of the chemicals. Lastly, the requirements of the employer should identify and register to record that has been mentioned. And also, the register should be maintained in a good order and condition. It shouldn't be applied if the employer has complied with the requirements of regulations 9 and 11.1 from the Environmental Quality Schedule Waste Regulation 1989. That's all from me. I will pass to the next member. Thank you.
For the permissible exposure limit, we have ceiling limit, 8-hour time weighted average, and compliance with permissible exposure limit using respirator. For the ceiling limit, an employer should ensure that the exposure of any person to any chemical hazardous to health listed in Schedule 1 at no time exceeds the ceiling limit specified for that chemical in that schedule. So the schedule we can see in the record keeping. Next, 8-hour time weighted average. An employer should ensure that the exposure of any person to any chemical hazardous to health listed in Schedule 1 in any 8-hour work shift of a work week does not exceed the 8-hour time weighted average airborne concentration specified for the chemical in that schedule, notwithstanding sub-regulation that I mentioned. The exposure of any person to any chemical hazardous to health listed in Schedule 1 should not exceed the maximum exposure limit for that chemical during the work shift. For the compliance with permissible exposure limit using respirator, the purpose of determining whether the employer has complied with the permissible exposure limit, the degree of protection afforded by the respirator for the periods during which the respirator is worn shall be taken into account. The period referred to in sub-regulation that I mentioned should be averaged with the exposure level of the airborne concentration during the period when respirators are not worn to determine the employee's daily time weighted average exposure. For the purpose of this regulation, degree of protection means the ratio of the airborne concentration of the contaminant outside the respirator to the concentration of contaminant inside the face piece of the respirator. For the assessment of risk to health, an employer should not carry out any work which may expose or is likely to expose any employee to any chemical hazardous to health unless he has made a written assessment of the risk created by the chemical to the health of the employee. So the assessments, as you can see, is listed on the slide. Where work which may expose or is likely to expose any employee to chemicals hazardous to health was commenced before the coming into operation of these regulations. The employer should conduct the assessment within 1 year from the date of coming into operation of these regulations. For the review assessment, the assessment carried out under regulation of assessment of risk to health should be reviewed if there has been a significant change in the work to which the assessment relates. More than 5 years have elapsed since the last assessment directed by the Director General, Deputy Director General, or the Director of Occupational Safety and Health. For the assessment to be carried out by an assessor, the employer should ensure that any assessment carried out pursuant to this part is conducted by an assessor. Next, for the assessment of risk to health report, any person appointed by the employer to carry out any assessment should, within 1 month of the completion of the assessment, furnish the employer with a report of the assessment. If the assessment carried out under sub-regulation under the sub-regulation 1 indicates that a place of work, plant, substance or process is likely to cause immediate danger to life or property. The person carrying out the assessment should immediately inform the employer about the danger. For the assessment report, the employer should ensure that the report of the assessment conducted pursuant to regulations assessment risk to health, so that is maintained in good order and condition for a period of not less than 30 years. The employer should make available the assessment report for the examination upon request by the Director General or by any employee exposed or likely to be exposed to chemicals hazardous to health. For the action to control expose, if an evaluation report indicates that action is needed to eliminate or reduce an employee's actual or potential exposure to chemical hazardous to health, an employer should take such action, which may include changes to work processes, practices, procedures, plant or engineering control equipment in 1 month after receiving the assessment report from the assessor. Employers should ensure that all countermeasures actions are be taken under sub-regulations that are mentioned or to chemicals that have been set with permitted exposure limits to below limits. The employers should control chemicals hazardous to health through the following countermeasures that is listed on the slide. Employers should ensure that all safe work systems and practices are documented, implemented, and reviewed whenever there are significant changes to installed processes, equipment, materials, or countermeasures. For the use of approved personal protective equipment, approved personal protective equipment must be used where the application of control measures would be impracticable as an interim measure while other preferred control measures are being designed and installed, and also where the measures taken to comply do not adequately control an employee's exposure to chemicals hazardous to health. If approved personal protective equipment is used to control exposure to chemicals hazardous to health, the employer should establish and implement procedures regarding on the publication, maintenance, inspection, and training in the use of the approved personal protective equipment. The approved personal protective equipment provided to employees pursuant to sub-regulation. So the approved is listed on the slide. For the engineering control equipment, any engineering control equipment is provided based on the application of engineering control equipment, and it must be checked, inspected, and also each engineering control equipment must be maintained and operated at all times while any machinery or plant is in operating, as well as a time thereafter, to comply with the sub-regulation of action to control expose, which has been stated in the second paragraph that I mentioned. For the design, construction, and commissioning of local exhaust ventilation equipment, without prejudice of the requirements of sub-regulation of engineering control equipment, locally installed exhaust ventilation equipment must design and tested. As you can see in the slide, I put the full sentence. And for the purpose of this regulation, registered professional engineer means an engineer registered under the Registration of Engineers Act 1967, Act 138. For the record of engineering control equipment, records of the design, constructions, testing, inspection, examination and maintenance of engineering control equipment pursuant to regulations, engineering, control equipment and design, construction and commissioning of local exhaust ventilation equipment should be maintained by the employer and should be produced for inspection when directed by the Director General.